Dando sequência às atividades do evento, começamos agora a conferência do professor Bahktin. Mais perto? E eu chamo para compor a mesa Bárbara Melissa Santana, mediadora. Ok. Bárbara Melissa Santana é graduada em Letras francês pela pela Unesp de Assis, mestre e atualmente doutoranda em Linguística e Língua Portuguesa pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Linguística e Língua Portuguesa da Unesp de Araraquara. Sob orientação da professora Luciane de Paula, desenvolveu durante a graduação o projeto de iniciação científica Ecologicamente Ideológico, a ideologia da sustentabilidade no discurso da natura, com o apoio da Agência de Fomento FAPESP. Durante o mestrado, desenvolveu a dissertação La Majorité opprimée, uma análise bakhtiniana do machismo de cada dia, também financiado pela FAPESP. E atualmente trabalha na tese de doutoramento intitulada A Trilogia 50 Tons, análise de um fenômeno transmediático com o apoio da CAPES.
Bom dia. Bom dia a todos, é muito bom ter todo mundo aqui, né? Espero que a gente possa ter uma conversa boa depois da apresentação do professor Bahktin. E para iniciar, eu gostaria de avisar a todos que a gente vai trabalhar com duas projeções, tá? Aqui vai ter o PPT do professor Bahktin, com uma tradução do slide que vai ser utilizado, e ali a tradução do texto que vai ser trabalhado pelo professor na fala dele. Tá? Então, todos vão poder acompanhar a fala do professor na versão em português ali naquela tela. Tá? Então, eu convido para compor a mesa o professor Bahktin. Can come? Bahktin é um professor George Steiner de Comparative Literature na Queen Mary University of London. E sua pesquisa mais recente tem sido sobre cosmopolitanismo, exílio e transnacionalismo. Suas publicações incluem 4 livros e 9 volumes em coorganização. Recebeu, com Eugênio Dobrenko, o prêmio F. Etnik de melhor livro sobre cultura russa, em 2012. Pelo livro A History of Russian Literature, Theory and Criticism, The Soviet Age and Beyond. Ele é membro da Academia Europeia e presidente honorário da ICLA, Committee on Literary Theory. Também é membro do Conselho Consultivo do Institute for World Literature da Harvard University e é conselheiro científico honorário do Institute of Foreign Literatures, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Então, com a palavra para a gente hoje, o professor Bahktin.
So, many thanks to all of you for inviting me, for translating the text, and for being here. As you can see, I'm still jet-lagged, so I got the time of the day wrong. Anyway, so my paper today is an attempt to understand how the work of a thinker travels across time and what journeying through languages and cultures has to do with these peregrinations. There is more at stake in this process than the certainty of canonization would suggest. Building on my previous work, I want to sketch out the principal trajectories of appropriating Bahktin in the West since the 1960s. This will allow me to revisit the question of Bahktin's longevity and the potential of his work to gain traction in current debates on world literature. My approach to Bahktin's legacy is sustained by a wider theory of translation, which comprehends translation both more globally and more historically. And Brazil is probably the right place to experiment with this approach, given all the wide-ranging and wonderful work of translation that is going on here. Let me begin with a historical excursus. Translation, in the modern sense in which we understand the term, is a fairly recent phenomenon. Its emergence is concomitant with a rising sense of intellectual property and of the significance originality and imagination play in literature and in scholarship that appears in the late 18th century. Before that, translation lives often other lives, those of imitation, transposition, rendition, emulation, and recreation of the text. This is true of the West as much as it is true of the wider cultural region formed by the Middle East, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. In the European context, we are aware of poetic contests that sought to emulate rhetorically examples of Greek and Roman poetry. These competitions were forms of translation. The resulting texts do not insist on originality, nor, importantly, do they insist on complete faithfulness. They present a mode of creativity that is beyond the binary expectations of either originality or loyalty, which we've grown to adhere to today. For centuries on end, helping oneself to someone else's plot or figure of speech or range of similes or metaphors, often suitably updated, was a way of ferrying an earlier discourse into a new zone of contemporaneity. This wider meaning of translation, which highlights both the passive following and the co-creative departure from the example, continues, to a lesser degree, to be constitutive of our seemingly more advanced, but perhaps also more one-sided understanding of translation today. As late as the 20th century, we can still observe this mode of consciously unfaithful translation in what in the German tradition is known as Nachdichtung, the making of poetry following another text, a process grounded in a deliberate refusal of copying or rendering that text with precision. Of course, there lurks behind all this the question of the canon. For it is the assumption of the rhetorical force and beauty of the canonical text that often enables these acts of permissible transgression. In Central Asia and Persia, as well as in the Arab-speaking world, for a very long time, the practice of translation remains alien to our modern notion of it. When Nizami, in the second half of the 12th century, creates his 5 epic poems in Persian, all through to the 18th century, we have nothing but forms of rendition that are based on emulation, adaptation, and conversation with the canonical pieces, but not on the literal reproduction our norms of translation would require. This emulation through conversation with the source text is a genre of its own at the time, known as nazire in Persian, and it denotes a work in its own right that responds to an earlier work by plunging today's reader into uncertainty as to where the line between translation, recreation, and original writing is to be drawn, if such a line exists at all, before the late 18th century. In the European case, of course, this is a long process that begins somewhere in the 16th century, and by the late 18th century, this modern notion of translation begins to crystallize. I would thus venture a hypothesis, for as long as the canon based on this certainty flowing from adherence to a combination of rhythm, plot, composition, and rhetorical figures remains in place, there is no imperative for literal repetition or exactitude. It is with the shift towards originality, the premium value placed on novelty, and the sense of property that emerges as a byproduct of this shift late in the 18th and in the first half of the 19th century, that tradition is put under strain and ceases to be self-evident. We know that it is precisely at that time that the European canon of great literature is constructed, in which Shakespeare takes pride of place, but no longer as the borrower of circulating plots, but rather as the originally irregular, chaotic, and disorderly potent genius that the German Romantics saw in him. Similarly, Calderon is unearthed from oblivion at that point, but not the Calderon who, in at least one of his plays, would help himself to an entire act in a place by Tirso de Molina, but rather the Calderon who had in the meantime become an emblem of the Baroque vacillation between dream and reality, the quality of unfolding, to invoke Deleuze. It is this Calderon who vacillates between dream and reality, who is a living emblem of the Baroque, that finds a place in this new canon that reshuffles the previous order and signals the virtues of instability, not least the unmooring of literature from a long-standing pool of recurring plots, meters, compositional patterns, and rhetorical devices. This is when translation as we know it becomes important, fitting into a new situation in which novelty and originality require to be captured with reliable precision of nuance. What is more, this is a process that, historically speaking, seems to me to be nothing but the culmination and the logical end to the protracted transition from powerful cosmopolitan koines, Greek, Latin, Persian, Sanskrit, to a multitude of vernaculars, each of which insists on its own inimitable vocabulary, sensitivity, and plasticity, in the way advocated by the many supporters of a presumably organic bond between language and thinking, from Humboldt to Georgy Gatchev. What I'm saying here is true of the way not just literary texts have been treated until the early 19th century. The translation of philosophical and political texts would be marked by the same relaxed interpretation of fidelity, by co-creation and adaptation, sometimes amounting to co-writing. One of my favorite examples is the first German translation of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France by that inveterate conservative Friedrich Gentz. Gentz published his translation of Burke's important book in 1793, only 3 years after its original publication. The translation is marked not just by inaccuracies, but by numerous insertions of Gentz's own thoughts and interpretations of Burke's work. By our standards today, this is not a reliable translation, and yet it is this translation that penetrated German and Austrian conservative debates and participated in them for more than a century and a half, until a modern German translation was published in the 1960s. The moral of the story here is one we may wish to keep in mind. The texture of ideas is discursive, and translations, even before the time our stricter notions of loyalty to the source text were introduced, have always been very much part of this texture. Once a translation begins its circulation, it begins its work through this discursive universe of which it becomes inseparable. The effects of a translation, once planted in the discursive body of culture, cannot be undone. The clock can never be turned back completely. This, of course, bears on how we see the task of the translator, to echo the title of Benjamin's famous essay, with regard to Mikhail Bahktin's corpus of texts. I should begin, perhaps, by saying that Bakhtin's position in this battle within modernity over the limits of dynamic originality on the one hand and stability based on recurrence on the other, a battle which we see enacted in the transition from a looser to a stricter notion of translation, reflects his own wider understanding of literature and culture. In a sense, Bahktin performs the opposite transition. He begins by sharing a belief in the uniqueness and originality of the writer, only to end up endorsing the overbearing power of tradition imprinted in what he calls the memory of genre. The entire intellectual evolution of Bahktin can be described as a struggle against psychologism and an ever more powerful negation of subjectivity in its classical identitarian version. He admitted to Vadim Kozhinov that Edmund Husserl and Max Scheler played a vital role in his re-education into a thinker who mistrusts psychologism. Beginning with the celebration of Dostoevsky as a unique and inimitable writer of singular achievement, Bahktin ended up in the 1930s in his essays on the novel, and in 1963 in the reworked version of his Dostoevsky book, focusing on the impersonal memory of genre, leaving little room for creativity as such, and examining instead the inherent laws of poetics. Note the change in the title of the 1963 book, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, not of Dostoevsky's creativity. Bakhtin's entire work and intellectual agenda, indeed the most important questions he sought to answer, are shaped by his resistance to traditionally conceived stable subjectivity. From the question of the body, which we gradually cease to possess and be in control of, as the book on Rabelais maintains, to the question of language, which, as the essays on the novel would have it, reaches us through established generic patterns and is never quite our own, as it has always already been in someone else's mouth. The fortunes of the novel embody this rejection of classical subjectivity in full measure. The individual writer is virtually irrelevant. He or she is no more than an instrument through which the genre materializes itself, no more than a mouthpiece that enunciates the calls of generic memory. Bakhtin, in other words, despite his apparent attraction to canonical figures such as Goethe, Dostoevsky, and Rabelais, would ideally have liked to be able to write a history of literature without names. The formula history without names was, of course, derived from the work of art historian Heinrich Wölfflin and had drawn approval from the Russian formalist Boris Eichenbaum and also from Pavel Medvedev, who, together with Matvei Kagan, was the most important transmitter of art historical and art theoretical knowledge in the Bakhtin circle. Bakhtin's trajectory is thus the trajectory of a thinker who returns from a more modern notion of individual originality and creativity to the notion of nameless tradition, in which stable discursive formations recur and suck in a manner that is as fascinating as it is unstoppable, the work of individual writers who are deprived of their individuation to become servants of tradition. Of course, Bakhtin remains modern as he performs this move, for tradition to him is not a soothing force. It is disruptive in the way the archaic is both disruptive but also enduringly constitutive of the modern. Bakhtin, then, is a thinker who de-emphasizes originality and property, those underlying features attached to our modern understanding of literature and its translation. If a pun be allowed, he retranslates literature away from the endeavor of individuals and towards the work of anonymous verbal masses that support the typomachia of dialogue and monologue, of the centripetal and the centrifugal. His most important book, in my no doubt biased judgment, the monograph on Rabelais, is a case in point. Admittedly, one of the 7 chapters of the book is dedicated to Rabelais' language. But even there, Bakhtin does not approach Rabelais from a philological perspective. Most of what he has to say on Rabelais' use of language is borrowed and readily acknowledged from Leo Spitzer and the work of other contemporaries. Nor are the principles of interpretation exclusively pertinent to or derived solely from literature. The reason for all this is that Bakhtin is trying to think in this book as a philosopher of culture. Language as such takes a back seat. It is drowned by the sweeping manifestations of culture produced by the body in simultaneous acts of laughter, eating, copulation, etc. One might say that Bakhtin's Rabelais book has non-verbal communication and creativity at its heart. Whether all this involves and license an approach towards Bakhtin's work that applies a charitable and more flexible understanding of translation away from the often unproductive obsession with terminological fixity is a difficult question. Bakhtin's work falls, roughly speaking, into 3 distinct periods. The first one, I think, is the time up until the first version of the Dostoevsky book, when Bakhtin is primarily preoccupied with ethics and aesthetics. The second phase encompasses the 1930s, the time when he thinks as a philosopher of culture, most preeminently in the essays on the novel and in the Rabelais book. Again, we should not be misled into considering these texts examples of philology or literary theory. Both Bakhtin and the formalists came of age by pushing away from preoccupations with aesthetics. Aesthetics was their shared starting point, but from there, the formalists developed into literary theorists, Bakhtin into a philosopher of culture who employs literary examples, but often, as in the book on Rabelais, also examples drawn from other domains, always in order to ponder larger issues that have to do with the deeper mechanisms of culture, its inner makeup and typology, and its evolution. The last stage in Bakhtin's intellectual career begins already in the early 1940s. This is the time when his attention is gradually claimed by the methodology of the humanities. The late appearance of the Rabelais book and the republication of the reworked Dostoevsky book have skewed our perspective on what is the longest period in Bakhtin's work, from the 1940s through to the early 1970s. What genuinely interests Bahktin here during this final period is a range of new questions that have a meta-dimension. What is an utterance? What is meaning? And how is it produced and communicated? What is the role of dialogue in how we understand the world we are immersed in? Yet, different as these three periods might arguably be, they have something very important in common: the way in which Bakhtin handles language. Whether preoccupied with philosophy of culture or with the nexus of moral philosophy and aesthetics, which he seeks to resolve in the first version of the Dostoevsky book by putting forward and valorizing a non-finalizing and non-objectifying polyphonic writing, Bakhtin's proper realm as thinker was the in-between territory that is confined to no particular discipline and that he inhabited with such non-negotiable sovereignty. It is this space between the disciplines that he it is in this space between the disciplines that he crafted his own metaphors that enabled him to move freely between different levels of argumentation and address issues located above and beyond particular fields of knowledge. Often elusively, but always extremely stimulatingly, Bakhtin lifts the categories he employs above the conceptual constraints of their home disciplines and instills in them new life by obliterating their previous conceptual identity. One brief example, the way in which he formulates the idea of dialogue, should suffice. We hear in Bakhtin's use of the word dialogue a linguistic substratum, which can probably be attributed to Lev Yakubinsky and a host of other early Soviet linguists. And yet, Bakhtin's specific interpretation of this category is so much wider, applicable to entire narratives and whole domains of culture, that focusing exclusively on its linguistic origins, even when these are attestable, would not explain the power and fascination of Bakhtin's dialogism. By way of illustration, we could reference here Jan Mukarzewski's important essay, Dialogue and Monologue, written in 1940, very much a contemporary of Bakhtin. Terminologically, Mukarzewski's text is much more disciplined and rigorous, and yet in scope and inventiveness, it lags behind Bakhtin's version of dialogue. Mukarzewski, who knew and was highly appreciative of some of Voloshinov's writings, works within a narrowly linguistic juxtaposition of dialogue and monologue. Bakhtin transcends this limitation. He refreshes our understanding of dialogue by inviting us to hear the dialogue within a single uttered word, or the dialogue and contestation embodied in voices that convey conflicting outlooks and perspectives on the world. Or indeed, dialogue is the foundation stone for a wide-ranging typology of cultural forms. This transformation, which subjects the term to inner growth, sometimes at the expense of exactitude, a transformation whereby the term expands its scope of relevance to the point of turning into a broader metaphor, is the most important feature informing Bakhtin's prose, the hallmark of his writings, especially those of the 1930s. It is this transformative energy that sets him apart from his likely or even demonstrable antecedents hailing from various specializations, be they linguistic, sociological, theological, or art historical for that matter. It is not difficult, for example, to demonstrate how several of Bakhtin's concepts, architectonics, space, Gothic realism, were derived, at least to a significant degree, from the German art historical tradition. This, however, would tell us very little about the significant transformation of these concepts when thrown into the melting pot of Bakhtin's argumentation. Bakhtin's originality as thinker is actually the originality of the great synthesizer, who took at liberty from various specialized discourses, linguistics, art history, theology, and then reshaped, extended, and augmented the scope of the respective concepts. Bakhtin is thus a thinker who handles language in a way that protects him from falling prey to terminological fetishism. His often metaphoric employment of terminology from different domains of knowledge gives volume and breadth to his writing and propels it into a quality that cannot be matched by a translation that shies away from preserving this potential metaphoricity. The failure to accept this hallmark of Bakhtin's writing has been responsible, at least in part, for the vicissitudes of his reception in the West since the 1960s. Bakhtin's discoveries have been articulated differently at different historical junctures and in different cultural settings. The Bakhtin we see today is a fluctuating image resulting from superimposed perspectives involving growth, modification, loss, and a complex adjustment of meaning as his body of writing travels across time, languages, and discursive traditions and meets inherited patterns of reasoning. Bakhtin's work is thus not a reliable supply of knowledge or wisdom. It rather derives from the elusive, sometimes blurred, and never quite finished work of mediation and translation. Thus, Bakhtin's legacy is the function of multiple historical articulations, a patrimony in transit and subject to translation and dialogue. We have to recall that Bakhtin's appropriation in the West commences under the sign of structuralism and its belief in scientific rigor. While in Russian, Bakhtin was thought to be a foe of formalism and structuralism, and by extension, in the eyes of his future opponents, such as Mikhail Kasparov, a denier of exact literary science, his career in the West, particularly in the Anglophone world, began and evolved for about 2 decades under the auspices of formalism and structuralism. Ladislav Matejka, an émigré scholar from Prague who had reached the United States via Sweden, published in 1962 a slender anthology titled Readings in Russian Poetics, incorporating texts in Russian by, amongst others, both Voloshinov and Bakhtin. The second edition, 1971, which was considerably expanded and published in English, carried the telling subtitle Formalist and Structuralist Views. It became the first major collection in the West to include translated work by Bakhtin and Voloshinov. Bakhtin was represented here with a portion of his 1929 Dostoevsky book, which Matejka had first read in a class offered at Harvard by the ubiquitous Dmytro Chizhevsky. Matejka was very clear about Bakhtin's status as a critic rather than a proponent of formalism. And yet, he described both Bakhtin and Voloshinov in his postscript as followers of the Russian formal method. The trend of packaging Bakhtin together with the formalists continued all through the 1970s, often on the grounds that his Dostoevsky book put the study of the ideas of Dostoevsky's novels second to the exploration of categories that originated in aesthetics, such as voice, author, or hero. This trend persisted for 2 decades until Caro Emerson and Michael Hallquist began translating and editing Bakhtin's essays on the novel, whose appearance marked a new stage in his discovery in the West during the 1980s and beyond. But let me also briefly point to the more difficult fortunes of Bakhtin's writings in 2 continental environments with strong domestic philosophical traditions, where Bakhtin's lax ways with terminology would not earn him much sympathy. In 2008 and 2011, Bakhtin's early texts, Author and Hero in Aesthetic Activity and Towards the Philosophy of the Act, were finally translated into German, thus rounding off the canon of his works available in that language. To be fair, an important text of Bakhtin's, his essay Epic and Novel, had first appeared in German translation at the end of 1968, with a publication date of 1969 in a collective volume in the GDR, before appearing anywhere else in any other language, including Russian. As Edward Kowalski reveals in his essayistic epilogue to the 2008 German translation of Author and Hero in Aesthetic Activity, the typescript of Bakhtin's article Epic and Novel was smuggled out of the Soviet Union following encouragement from Kozhinov. The Russian text was published only in 1970 in the journal Vопросы литературы. Bakhtin's Dostoevsky and Rabelais books, as well as his other essays on the novel, were also translated into German without much delay. Yet in Germany, his discovery seemed to have been hampered by the resistance of a rich and elaborate domestic philosophical tradition, which found it difficult to relate to Bakhtin's evocative, but by the standards of that tradition, largely loose and floating style of reasoning. Bakhtin's impact in Germany hardly went beyond Slavic studies, with the exception of some Bakhtinian presence in art and film theory. In France, Bakhtin's discovery faced similar barriers. In a 1998 interview with Clive Thompson, Julia Kristeva complained that Bakhtin's style was alien to the Cartesian spirit of the French humanities. Bakhtin's writing seemed to generate too many ambiguities and too little terminology. As if to placate these concerns, in her own work, Kristeva had taken Bakhtin's unstable, fluid, yet extremely productive notion of dialogue and had rather controversially upgraded it to intertextuality, a shift which she believed not only made Bakhtin her contemporary, but also added that indispensable degree of lucidity, arguably also objectivity, which the French public appears to have missed in his works. Kristeva is acutely aware of Bakhtin's precarious status as a thinker, measured by the requirements of the various fields of specialized knowledge. He doesn't quite fit anywhere. The central categories of his mature writings, body and discourse, were perceived as either too vague or too obsolete by the French psychologists, anthropologists, and linguists. We thus see that Bakhtin's peregrinations across linguistic and disciplinary borders have had everything to do with his own mode of handling language and terminology. The lifting of the structureless curtain that had been obscuring the ultimate impossibility of thinking literature and culture by deploying a disinterested meta-language has revealed a Bahktin who gains in active translation which do not seek to reify his prose in a string of one-dimensional concepts. Of course, the case for translating and interpreting Bahktin with due sensitivity for his capacious and often unfixed terminology should not be pushed too far. The early Bahktin, for example, was serious about phenomenology as towards a phenomenology of the act, author and hero in aesthetic activity, but also the problem of content, material, and form in verbal art abundantly demonstrate. As late as the early 1940s, in a fragment from Towards the Philosophical Foundations of the Humanities, Философским основам гуманитарных наук, in which he takes his leave from phenomenology, Bahktin confronts his readers with a piece of philosophical prose that poses multiple challenges. And I will read this fragment in Russian, and I'll comment on it in English, and you will see the Portuguese translation. First, the Russian text, which is incredibly beautiful and astoundingly deep, and there are bits in it which really befuddle the potential translator. Проблема понимания. So this is written in Bahktin's typical nominal sentences that do not contain verbs. Проблема понимания. Понимание как видение смысла, но не феноменальное, а видение живого смысла переживания и выражения. Видение внутреннеосмысленного, так сказать, самоосмысленного явления. Выражение как осмысленная материя или материализованный смысл, элемент свободы, пронизавший необходимость. Внешняя и внутренняя плоть для милования. Различные пласты души в разной мере поддаются овнешнению. Невнешняемое художественное ядро души «я для себя». Встречная активность познаваемого предмета. Now you can see the Portuguese translation. Yeah, there is a Portuguese. I think I was shown the. So maybe the previous one more. Yes, thank you, thank you. Let me comment on the challenges of this passage when you try to render it in any language, be it English or Portuguese. Clearly, Bahktin here activates a vocabulary that is as recognizably Hegelian, an element of freedom that had shot through necessity, but also the word externalization, the Hegelian and Äußerung, as it is Platonic and phenomenological when he says видение смысла. Yeah? So he rejects the phenomenological perspective, and yet he activates a vocabulary that is recognizably phenomenological and Hegelian. And any translator has to deal with that. Any translator has to acknowledge the terminological layer that this passage is erected upon. A translator, thus, will have no choice but to heed this fixed layer of terminology. Yet even here, the fragment carries an almost untranslatable potentiality inscribed in the noun milovanie, to be rendered most certainly as caressing, but to a reader of Russian, if read out with a different accentuation, milovanie instead of milovanie, same word, only different accentuation. This word, if read out as milovanie, would trigger associations not with caressing, but with forgiveness and absolution. This example, very much in the noble spirit of discussing how one should approach the task of translation, committing us to hands-on textual work, is only one illustration of the rewarding, perhaps also daunting task of translating Bakhtin's philosophical prose. And you can figure out from the Portuguese translation how inevitably you're facing the task of preserving the terminology, but also somehow conveying the multiple potentiality that is dormant in some of the words. And that is no simple task. Before I proceed to my conclusion, allow me to dwell on a particular aspect of Bakhtin's work. And maybe we can, just before we continue, maybe we can see the English fragments, yeah? Okay, so, okay. Okay, the next one, please. Yeah, so you see here externalization. You can see the element of freedom that has permeated necessity. All of this preserves the Hegelian and the phenomenological register. And you see, this is Irina Denishchenko's translation that is about to be published next year in a new volume of Bakhtin's philosophical fragments. And you can see the next one, please. Yeah. No, next one. Further. Yeah. Further down. Yes. Yes. No. Before that. Thank you. Yeah. So you can see here what she does with this very difficult word, milovanie. She's obviously aware of the ambiguity between acquittal, forgiveness, and caressing. And what she does here, she renders it as merciful caressing, which I think is a very good translation that captures this potentiality that evolves within the text. Thank you. So, before I proceed to my conclusion, allow me to dwell on a particular aspect of Bakhtin's work in which the significance of translation and Bakhtin's renewed relevance for current discussions in literary studies is apparent in a most telling manner. Many of you would be familiar with the recent rise, or historically speaking, I should say, return of world literature as a prism through which to spectate and study literature. A lot of this hinges on the question of the legitimacy of working in translation. There are those like David Damrosch who believe this legitimacy to be beyond doubt, and those like Emily Apter who fear that the failure to accept that certain things are untranslatable fuels the practice of harnessing translation for the production of wrong and ideologically harmful equivalences. Let me begin by stating that today the legacy of modern literary theory is not available in a pure and concentrated fashion. Instead, it is dispersed, dissipated, often fittingly elusive. The reason for this is that this inheritance is now performing its work in a climate already dominated by a different regime of relevance, which it faces directly and which it must negotiate. The patrimony of literary theory is currently active within a regime of relevance that thinks literature through its market and entertainment value, with only residual recall of its previously highly treasured autonomy. It is this regime of relevance that has engendered the interpretative framework of world literature that has recently grown and gained enormous popularity, also in the classroom. I take the words world literature in quotation marks, for they refer to a particular liberal Anglo-Saxon discourse grounded in assumptions of mobility, transparency, and recontextualizing, but also decontextualizing circulation that supports free consumption and unrestricted comparison of literary artifacts. If we look at Russian literary theory during the interwar decades, we would be struck to see that many of its major trends were obliquely or more directly relevant to this new framework of understanding and valorizing literature in the regime of its global production and consumption. Bakhtin begins his work on Rabelais with a reference precisely to world literature. I quote from the very first page of the Rabelais book. Of all great writers of world literature, Rabelais is the least popular, the least understood and appreciated. End of quote. Bakhtin, however, pays lip service to the then powerful notion of world literature as a body of canonical writing, which was powerful not just in the Soviet Union, but throughout Europe at the time. He ostensibly compares Rabelais to Cervantes, Shakespeare, and Voltaire. But this understanding of world literature does not really interest him. Instead, he takes a different route, reconceptualizing the study of world literature as a study of the process that shapes the novel to become a universal global genre, a global discursive power that, in Bakhtin's own words, colonizes all other genres. Of course, Bakhtin is here indebted to the Russian formalists. For him, too, the novel is the underdog of world literature, whose discursive energies are at first feeble and scattered, unnamed for a long time, until they begin to coalesce and rise to prominence. Bakhtin's engagement with world literature holds a distinctly non-Eurocentric and, let me argue this point, non-philological charge. He works with the novels he lists mostly in translation, as does Shklovsky before him. Bakhtin appears to be relying on a Western canon to validate his thesis, but in truth, he is more interested in the literature and culture of pre-modernity, the time when Europe is not yet a dominant force, before the continent begins to see itself as the center of the world. Bakhtin is thus actually a thinker much more fascinated by the subterranean cultural deposits of folklore, of minor discourses, of ancient genres, of anonymous verbal masses, all of which long predates European culture of the age of modernity, beginning roughly with the Renaissance, which is the only dominant European culture we know. Even Rabelais' novel, a masterpiece of the Renaissance, interests him for its more traditional, pre-modern, folklore-based layers. Bakhtin performs a flight away from Eurocentrism, not by writing on non-European cultures, but by writing on pre-European cultures, on cultures that occupy the old shared territory of folklore, rites and rituals, of myth and epic narratives, before Europe even begins to emerge as an entity on the cultural and political map of the world. His is an anti-Eurocentric journey not in space, but in time. His contemporaries, the semantic paleontologists Nikolai Marr and Olga Freidenberg, whose writings Bahktin knew, did something similar in their work on myth and pre-literary discourses. All of this casts Bahktin's work in a new light and allows us to enlist him as an early predecessor of the anti-Eurocentric and translation-friendly drive of today's Anglo-Saxon academic programs in world literature. At the end of this paper, I wish to return to its title. Some of you will have recognized in the title a reference to Carol Emerson's article, The Next 100 Years of Mikhail Bahktin, published in the year 2000. 82 more years to go until the end of the century. The excitement and the anxiety here stem from the fact that we cannot possibly know which longue durée this century in retrospect will have turned out to be part of, or to speak in Bakhtinian terms, how this century will have positioned itself vis-à-vis great time. We know by now that great literature is a historically attestable category that has both a birth and an expiry date. Will there be great thinkers by the end of the century, or will this too have proved to be a construct that disintegrates once the foil of a universal humanity is withdrawn? Bakhtin's work cannot answer these questions, but it can infuse trust in the eventual returns of meaning, celebrated for its ability to cross borders, to exude invigorating and challenging multiplicity, and to resist monopolizing appropriation. Ferrying a thinker across time and language, translation becomes the platform that can turn these returns into departures. Thank you.
Obrigada, professor. Thank you, Professor Galim. Agora nós vamos abrir para questões. Quem tiver alguma questão para propor para o professor Galim, quiser colocar alguma coisa, é só pedir o microfone ou vir aqui à frente. Sim, se precisar de tradução, posso ajudar também, tá?
Obrigada pela contribuição, professor. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta de tradução. A palavra eslovo em russo, para o português, às vezes a gente vê ela traduzida como gênero da palavra, como palavra e como discurso. Os textos em português não são muito claros na tradução, eu acho que por conta do contexto. E eu queria saber como é que você traduz para o inglês e qual seria a melhor tradução.
Okay. Yeah.
She's asking about the word eslovo, that we have some translations in Portuguese, and how this is dealt in English.
English faces exactly the same problem of multiplicity, and I think the key here is actually to think of not even the broader context as much, although this is also necessary, but to think at what stage in his intellectual trajectory Bahktin is using this word. Yeah? Because early on, until about the Dostoevsky book, and particularly the 1930s essays on the novel, Bahktin is not really interested in language, and he's not interested in genre, yeah? And he's, in that sense, not a theorist of discourse, yeah? The early phase, where he's primarily a moral philosopher who derives his concerns from aesthetics and really wants to answer the question, is the objectification of the other that happens in the act of writing morally permissible? That early stage, if you see the word slova, I think you can be a little bit more relaxed in the sense that it is clear that it doesn't signal a theory of discourse, because he's not interested in language and genre at that stage. But later on, in the 1930s, this changes. And of course, then you have to be very attentive to what is really meant. Is it the individual word? Is it an entire speech act? Or thirdly, does the word slova stand for discourse? Yeah? And in English, I think this problem is pretty much solved when it comes to the 1930s with this title, Discourse in the novel, Slova Framani. Yeah? And I think this is a very appropriate translation. Then again, in the late 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, when he launches this inquiry, meta-inquiry into what constitutes an utterance, meaning, and so on, there is probably a new dynamic to how he uses this. So I would say it's probably helpful to try to anchor this in the different stages of his own trajectory as a thinker.
Thank you. Tudo certo? Temos mais alguma questão? Temos tempo para mais uma questão, se alguém quiser perguntar ou falar. Não? Podemos fechar, então? Bom, então nós agradecemos mais uma vez. Thank you.
Thank you all.
For your presence here this morning. Pela presença do professor, né, com a sua fala, muito relevante para nós e para o momento que os estudos bakhtinianos estão sendo realizados no Brasil, né, muito importantes para a gente. E seguimos, então, com a programação para o café agora.
And thank you to those who translated the text. Thank you very much. And,
Thank you, Galim.